Have you ever wondered what happens when two worlds collide in the most unexpected moment of history? When ancient warrior blood meets royal protocol? And when words spoken in a palace corridor change the course of an entire war? Before we dive into this incredible story, I need your help. First, comment below telling me where you're watching from, and then hit that subscribe button. This channel depends on you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. Your support means everything. The rain fell hard on the ancient stones of Windsor Castle that cold November afternoon in 1943. Inside the grand reception hall, beneath oil paintings of kings and queens stretching back through centuries, a scene was unfolding that no protocol officer could have prepared for. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Consort, stood near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, her hands clasped before her, watching as a group of men unlike any she had ever received were being escorted through the palace corridors. They were American soldiers. That much was clear from their uniforms. But these were not the typical GIs she had grown accustomed to meeting during the countless morale visits and ceremonies of the war years. These men moved differently. Their eyes scanned the ornate hallways with an awareness that seemed to penetrate beyond the gilt and grandeur, reading the space the way their ancestors had read desert canyons and mountain passes. They were Apache warriors, descendants of Geronimo and Cochise, now serving in the United States Army, and they had come to England with secrets that would alter the trajectory of the European theater. Major James Cayeta was the first to enter the reception hall. His grandfather had ridden with Geronimo during the final resistance campaigns in Arizona. His father had served in the First World War, returning with medals and stories that were never quite believed back home. Now James stood in the presence of British royalty, carrying intelligence so sensitive that it had been hand-delivered across the Atlantic in a locked case chained to his wrist. The Queen approached with measured grace, her face betraying nothing of the curiosity that burned behind her eyes. Protocol demanded certain formalities, certain distances, but something in that moment transcended protocol. She extended her hand, not in the perfunctory manner of 1,000 previous greetings, but with genuine interest. What she said in that moment was never recorded in the official palace transcripts. The conversation that followed was deliberately omitted from the war diaries kept by both the British War Office and the American Command. But those who were present in that hall, the handful of officers and aides who witnessed the exchange, would carry the memory until their dying days. According to Lieutenant Christopher Marsh, a young British intelligence officer who stood just 3 meters away, the Queen's first words were unexpected. She did not offer the standard welcome. She did not speak of alliance or gratitude. Instead, she looked directly at Major Cayeta and said something in a language that caused the Apache officer to freeze, his expression shifting from formal courtesy to profound shock. She had spoken in Apache, not fluently, but clearly enough. A phrase, a greeting. Words that should have been impossible for an English queen to know. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but those who remembered it described it as stretching into eternity. Major Cayeta recovered quickly, his military training reasserting itself. He responded in English, his voice steady despite the questions that must have flooded his mind. How did the Queen of England know Apache? Why had she chosen that moment to reveal this knowledge? And what did it mean for the mission that had brought these warriors across an ocean to a land so foreign to everything they knew? The answer lay in a history that had been carefully concealed, a thread connecting the British Empire's past to the American Southwest, linking Victorian exploration to Apache resistance, and binding the fate of nations through secrets passed down in whispered conversations and encrypted diplomatic cables. In 1879, during the height of Apache resistance against American expansion, a small contingent of British observers had been granted permission by the United States government to study the conflict. Officially, they were there to learn military tactics that might be applied to colonial conflicts in Africa and India. Unofficially, they were documenting something else entirely: the languages, the codes, the intricate communication systems that allowed Apache warriors to coordinate across vast distances without written orders, without telegraph lines, without anything the conventional military mind could intercept or decode. One of those observers was a young scholar named Edmund Whitmore, whose official title was military attaché, but whose real expertise lay in linguistics and anthropology. Whitmore spent 18 months embedded with American forces in New Mexico and Arizona territories. But unlike his fellow officers who maintained distance from the indigenous populations, Whitmore became obsessed with understanding Apache culture. He learned fragments of the language. He documented their signaling systems. He recorded songs and stories that had been passed down through generations. When Whitmore returned to England, he brought with him notebooks filled with observations that both fascinated and disturbed the British intelligence community. Here was a people who could transmit complex military information across miles of hostile terrain using nothing but subtle variations in smoke signals, arrangements of stones, and a spoken language so tonal and precise that even slight mispronunciations changed meanings entirely. The notebooks were filed away, classified, and largely forgotten as the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian period, and then to the First World War. But in 1939, as Europe plunged into another devastating conflict, and as intelligence agencies desperately sought new methods of secure communication, someone remembered Edmund Whitmore's research. The person who rediscovered those notebooks was a young linguist named Victoria Bowes-Lyon, a distant cousin of the woman who would become Queen Elizabeth. Victoria had been recruited into the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, where the brilliant minds of Britain worked to break German encryption systems. In her spare time, she explored the archives, driven by an academic curiosity that had been discouraged in her formal education but never extinguished. When Victoria found Whitmore's Apache research, she recognized something that had eluded military analysts for decades: the potential for indigenous languages to serve as unbreakable codes. She wrote a detailed memorandum proposing that the British and American forces collaborate on a project that would utilize Native American languages for tactical communications. Her memo was read by exactly 4 people before being classified at the highest level. One of those 4 readers was her cousin Elizabeth, who by then had become Queen Consort after her husband ascended to the throne as King George VI. The Queen had access to intelligence briefings that few civilians ever saw. She understood the stakes of the war. She understood the desperate need for communication security. And she understood, perhaps better than the military men around her, that dismissing indigenous knowledge was not just morally wrong, but strategically foolish. When the American military began deploying code talkers using Navajo, Comanche, and eventually Apache languages for battlefield communications in the Pacific Theater, the British intelligence community took notice. But there was resistance. Some commanders doubted the effectiveness. Others questioned whether indigenous soldiers could be trusted with sensitive information. The prejudices that had marginalized Native Americans for centuries did not disappear simply because there was a war on. The Queen used her influence quietly, but effectively. She arranged meetings. She asked pointed questions during briefings. She made it clear, in the careful diplomatic language that royalty employs, that she believed the code talkers represented not just a tactical advantage, but a moral imperative, a recognition that the defense of freedom required embracing all who fought for it, regardless of their origins. Which brings us back to that rainy afternoon in November 1943, to Windsor Castle, to the Grand Reception Hall, and to the moment when Queen Elizabeth spoke Apache to Major James Kayata. The intelligence that Major Kayata carried in that locked case was not about troop movements or battle plans. It was something far more valuable. A complete encryption system based on Apache linguistic structures designed for use in the European theater. The system had been tested in the Pacific with devastating effectiveness against Japanese forces. Now, with the planning underway for the invasion of France, Allied commanders needed a communication method that the Germans absolutely could not break. But there was a problem. The Apache code talkers who had developed the system refused to deploy to Europe unless certain conditions were met. They wanted assurance that their cultural knowledge would be respected. They wanted guarantees that their contribution would be acknowledged, not buried in classified files and forgotten like so many Native American sacrifices had been forgotten. They wanted, in short, to meet the woman who had advocated for their inclusion when others had dismissed them. They wanted to meet the Queen. The request was unprecedented. It violated protocol. It complicated security arrangements. It risked exposure of one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. But the Queen agreed immediately. What transpired in Windsor Castle over the next 3 hours was never fully documented. The Apache officers were sworn to secrecy. The British staff was ordered to remain silent. Even the American command, which had reluctantly authorized the visit, kept minimal records. But fragments of the conversation emerged over the years, pieced together from deathbed confessions, declassified memos with redactions that were sometimes more revealing than the visible text, and the memories of those few individuals who witnessed history being made in whispers and careful words. The Queen did not speak Apache fluently. That much became clear quickly. But she had studied. She had learned key phrases from Victoria's research notes. She had practiced pronunciation with a linguist advisor who had been quietly recruited for this very purpose. Her effort was not about impressing the Apache officers. It was about showing respect. It was about acknowledging that their language, their culture, and their knowledge had value that went beyond military utility. Major Kayata later wrote in a personal letter that was not discovered until after his death. She understood what no general ever did. She knew that when we spoke our language in service of this war, we were not just encoding messages. We were asserting our existence. We were proving that what they tried to erase in boarding schools and reservations could not be erased. Every word we transmitted was an act of survival and defiance. The Apache encryption system was deployed in Europe beginning in January 1944. It was used extensively during the Normandy invasion. It proved, as predicted, to be unbreakable. German intelligence officers, who had successfully penetrated numerous Allied codes, were utterly baffled by the Apache transmissions. They had no reference points, no linguistic frameworks, no way to even begin cryptanalysis. The advantage it provided in coordinating the complex operations of D-Day and the subsequent liberation of France was immeasurable. But the deeper story, the one that remained hidden, was about what happened after that meeting at Windsor Castle. The Queen had made promises to Major Kayata and his men. Promises about recognition. Promises about respect. Promises that would prove difficult to keep as the war dragged on, and as post-war politics reasserted old prejudices and priorities. In July 1944, 7 months after the Windsor Castle meeting, a coded Apache transmission was intercepted not by German forces, but by American intelligence officers who had not been briefed on the Code Talker program. The message, when it was finally decoded by authorized personnel, contained information that was not related to military operations. It was a warning. It spoke of betrayal within the Allied command structure. It suggested that someone with high-level access was passing information to elements within the British establishment who did not share the Queen's views on indigenous participation. The warning was dismissed as paranoia. Major Kayata was quietly reassigned. The investigation that should have followed never materialized. And then, in September 1944, 3 Apache code talkers were killed in what was officially recorded as a training accident at a base in southern England. The circumstances were suspicious. The men had been among the most experienced operators. They died when a munitions storage building exploded during a routine inspection. No satisfactory explanation was ever provided for why all 3 were inspecting the same building, why the explosion occurred at that precise moment, or why the investigation report was classified above top secret, a designation normally reserved for nuclear weapons research and signals intelligence. Lieutenant Christopher Marsh, who had witnessed the Queen's first meeting with the Apache officers, was assigned to investigate the deaths. What he discovered troubled him so deeply that he requested an immediate meeting with military intelligence superiors. That meeting never took place. Marsh was found dead in his London apartment 2 weeks later. The official cause was listed as suicide. His family never accepted the ruling. The Queen, when informed of these events, demanded answers. She used every channel available to her, every connection, every privilege of her position. She discovered that there were forces within the British military and intelligence community who viewed the Code Talker program with hostility, not because of its effectiveness, but because of what it represented. These were men who had built careers on imperial assumptions about racial hierarchies, who saw the recognition of indigenous knowledge as a threat to the established order. The struggle between the Queen's faction and what came to be called the Old Guard reached a critical point in late 1944. Documents that were partially declassified in the 1990s reveal that there was serious consideration given to terminating the Code Talker program entirely, replacing it with mechanical encryption devices that were slower and more vulnerable, but that did not require, as one memo put it, reliance on primitive tribal languages and the men who speak them. The Queen intervened personally. She did something that queens are not supposed to do. She threatened. She made it clear that if the Code Talker program was terminated, if the Apache officers were removed from service, if the promises she had made were broken, she would make the entire affair public. She would expose the prejudice. She would reveal the deaths. She would use her position to ensure that history recorded not just Allied victory, but Allied shame. The threat worked. The Code Talker program continued. The Apache encryption system remained in operation through the end of the European War. Additional deaths were prevented, though the men who had opposed the program were never held accountable for those that had already occurred. But the cost of this victory was silence. The Queen's threat ensured that the Code Talkers could continue their work, but it also ensured that their story would be buried. The classification that protected them during the war became the classification that erased them after it. For decades, the Apache Code Talkers of the European theater were forgotten, their contribution denied, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Major James Caeta returned to Arizona in 1946. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. When researchers tried to interview him in the 1980s as part of a project documenting Native American military contributions, he declined, saying only that there were promises he had made that he intended to keep. He died in 1992, taking his stories with him. The Queen kept her own silence. In all her years of public service, through all the speeches and appearances and ceremonies, she never mentioned the Apache Code Talkers. When asked about her wartime activities, she spoke in generalities about morale work and hospital visits. She never revealed what she had learned about the prejudice and violence that had been directed at the men she had tried to help. Victoria Bowes-Lyon, the linguist who had rediscovered Edmund Whitmore's research and started the chain of events that brought Apache warriors to Windsor Castle, survived the war but never recovered from what she had witnessed. She spent her final years in quiet seclusion, working on a manuscript about indigenous contributions to Allied victory. The manuscript was never completed. After her death in 2003, her papers were donated to the Imperial War Museum, where they remain, mostly unexamined, in the archives. The full truth about what the Queen said when Apache American soldiers first arrived in England may never be known. The classified documents from that meeting will not be declassified in our lifetime. Those who were present are gone. But what we do know suggests that it was more than a greeting. It was a recognition. It was an acknowledgement that the fight for freedom required not just military might, but moral courage. The courage to see beyond the prejudices of the past, to embrace allies wherever they came from, and to understand that sometimes the most powerful weapon is respect. The legacy of that encounter continues to unfold. In recent years, historians have begun to piece together the story of the Apache code talkers in Europe. Families have come forward with letters and photographs. Documents have been declassified. Slowly, painfully slowly, the silence is breaking. But questions remain. Why were some voices allowed to speak while others were silenced? Who benefited from the erasure of this history? And what other stories remain buried in classified archives, waiting for someone brave enough to demand the truth? The rain has long since stopped falling on Windsor Castle. The grand reception hall stands as it did that November afternoon in 1943, unchanged except for the passage of time. But the echoes of that meeting still resonate. They remind us that history is not just written by the victors. It is also erased by those who find certain truths inconvenient, certain heroes unacceptable, certain sacrifices impossible to acknowledge without undermining the myths they have constructed about themselves. As this story reaches you today, understand that it is incomplete. There are pieces missing. There are voices still silenced. There are families who deserve answers they will never receive. The truth about what happened when Apache warriors came to England and met a queen who spoke their language is still emerging from the shadows where it was deliberately hidden. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not what we have learned, but what we suspect still remains concealed, waiting in locked files and forgotten memories, for someone to ask the right questions and refuse to accept the official silence. The photograph was discovered in 2018, tucked inside a Bible that had belonged to Corporal Thomas Nietzsche, one of the 3 Apache code talkers who died in the munitions explosion of September 1944. His granddaughter found it while sorting through belongings that had been stored in an attic in Oklahoma for 7 decades. The photo showed 5 men in American military uniforms standing outside what appeared to be an old church somewhere in the English countryside. On the back, written in faded pencil, were 5 names and a date: September 8, 1944. That was 6 days before the explosion. When historians examined the photograph, they noticed something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The church in the background was identifiable: St. Michael's in the village of Hawthorne, approximately 40 kilometers from the base where the explosion occurred. But according to military records, no Apache code talkers were ever stationed near Hawthorne. There was no official reason for them to be there. And yet, there they were, photographed in a place they should never have been. Days before 3 of them would die under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Further research revealed that St. Michael's Church had a history that stretched back to the 12th century. But it also had a more recent history that was considerably more troubling. During the 1930s, the church had been attended by several members of what would later be identified as a fascist sympathizer network within the British aristocracy. These were people who had believed, before the war made such beliefs untenable in public discourse, that Nazi Germany represented order and strength, while democracy represented weakness and decay. When the war began, most of these individuals either genuinely changed their views or learned to hide them effectively. But intelligence reports from the period suggest that a small corps never abandoned their ideological commitments. They simply became more careful. They understood that Britain would likely win the war, and they began positioning themselves not to support German victory, but to shape British victory in ways that aligned with their hierarchical, racialist worldview. The discovery that 3 Apache code talkers had visited a church with connections to fascist sympathizers just days before their deaths opened investigative pathways that had been closed for decades. Researchers began to ask questions that should have been asked in 1944. What were those men doing in Hawthorne? Who had sent them there? And most importantly, who had known they would be there? The answer emerged from an unlikely source. A journal kept by Eleanor Hartwell, a British nurse who had worked at the military hospital where injured code talkers were sometimes treated. Eleanor had died in 1997, but her daughter discovered the journal in 2019 while researching her mother's wartime experiences. The journal entries from September 1944 were explosive. Eleanor wrote about treating a young Apache soldier, she did not record his name, who had come to the hospital not with battle injuries, but with what he described as poisoning. He was convinced that someone had contaminated his food. He was terrified, not of enemy action, but of betrayal from within the Allied forces. Eleanor noted that he spoke of a meeting that was supposed to happen, a meeting that had been arranged by someone claiming to represent the Queen's office, someone offering information about the men who had opposed the Code Talker program. The meeting was supposed to take place at St. Michael's Church in Hawthorne. It never happened, or if it did, it was a trap. 3 days after the soldier spoke with Eleanor, he was dead in the munitions explosion. Eleanor wrote that she tried to report his concerns to military authorities. She was told firmly that Apache soldiers were sometimes prone to paranoia due to the stress of their work, that there was no evidence of foul play, and that she should focus on her nursing duties and leave intelligence matters to those trained to handle them. Eleanor never forgot. She carried the guilt for 50 years, believing that she should have done more, should have pushed harder, should have found someone who would listen. Her journal entries from the years after the war show a woman haunted by the conviction that she had witnessed the beginning of a murder and done nothing to prevent it. But Eleanor's testimony, valuable as it was, only deepened the mystery. If the meeting at Hawthorne had been a trap, who had set it? Who had possessed enough detailed knowledge of the Code Talker program to know which men to target? And who had the authority to use the Queen's name as bait? The investigation that should have followed these revelations was blocked at every turn. Archives remained sealed. Freedom of information requests were denied on national security grounds. Families who tried to learn the truth about their ancestors were met with bureaucratic walls that seemed designed not to protect sensitive information, but to protect guilty parties who might still be alive, or whose descendants might still hold positions of power. In 2020, a retired British intelligence officer named Sir Malcolm Pemberton broke 75 years of silence. He was 98 years old, dying of cancer, and apparently decided that whatever oaths he had sworn no longer mattered in the face of eternity. In an interview with a documentary filmmaker, Sir Malcolm confirmed what researchers had long suspected. There had been a faction within British intelligence that had actively sabotaged the Code Talker program. These were not German spies or double agents. They were British officers who believed that allowing Native Americans to play a crucial role in the war effort set a dangerous precedent. They feared that recognizing indigenous contributions would embolden colonial independence movements in Africa, India, and elsewhere. They worried that the racial hierarchies that justified empire would be undermined by proof that non-European peoples possessed sophisticated knowledge that Europeans could not match. Sir Malcolm would not name names. He would not identify who had ordered the killings or who had arranged the trap at Hawthorne, but he did say something chilling. The operation had approval at the highest levels. Not the highest, of course. The king and queen knew nothing, but high enough that it could be carried out and covered up for 3/4 of a century. The question that haunted researchers after Sir Malcolm's revelation was simple but terrible. If the Queen had not authorized the meeting at Hawthorne, if someone had used her name to lure Apache soldiers to their deaths, did she ever learn the truth? And if she did learn it, what did she do? The answer came from an unexpected source. A letter found in the personal papers of Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister, after those papers were partially released in 2021. The letter, dated March 1945, was written by the Queen to her sister. It was marked personal and private, never intended for any eyes but Margaret's. In it, the Queen wrote about a betrayal that she had only recently learned of, about promises that had been broken by men she had trusted, and about murders that had been committed in the King's name without the King's knowledge. The Queen wrote that she had been informed of the deaths at the time, but had been told they were accidents. It was only months later, through her own private inquiries, that she learned the truth. She had been used. Her advocacy for the code talkers had been noted by those who opposed them. Her meeting with Major Kayeta had been documented, and someone had weaponized her good intentions, using her name to create trust that could then be exploited. The letter revealed the Queen's anguish, but also her frustration. She could not go public with what she knew without risking the alliance between Britain and America, without exposing rifts within the British establishment at a moment when unity was essential for final victory. She was trapped by her position, able to help in small ways, but unable to seek the justice she knew was deserved. She wrote, "I think of those men every day. I think of the promises I made to them. I think of how my words, spoken in good faith, became weapons used against them. And I wonder if there is any redemption possible for such failures, even those committed through ignorance and manipulation." The letter ended with a commitment. When this war is over, when the immediate crisis has passed, I will find a way to tell their story. I will ensure they are remembered. This I promise. But that promise was never fulfilled. The Queen never spoke publicly about the Apache code talkers. The official histories of the war mentioned them only in passing, if at all. The classification that had been imposed during the war remained in place long after any legitimate security concerns had expired. Whether the Queen was prevented from keeping her promise or chose not to fight battles she could not win is a question that may never be answered definitively. What is known is that in the years immediately after the war, several British officers who had been involved in intelligence operations during the conflict died under unusual circumstances. One fell from a train platform in 1947. Another suffered a fatal heart attack in 1949, despite having no history of heart disease. A third disappeared while sailing alone off the coast of Scotland in 1951, and was never found. Were these coincidences, or were they consequences? Was someone settling accounts, eliminating those who knew too much about what had been done to the Apache code talkers? The speculation has persisted for decades, fueled by the fact that the men who died had all served in or around the same intelligence units during the war. Units whose records remain largely classified even today. Major James Kayeta, who survived the war and returned to Arizona, lived a long life but not necessarily a peaceful one. His family members recall that he suffered from nightmares, that he would wake screaming about explosions and betrayals. He never explained these nightmares in detail, but after his death, his wife found a box hidden in their basement. Inside were letters, documents, and photographs that James had kept secret for nearly 50 years. Among those documents was a copy of a report that should not have existed outside of classified archives. It was an internal British intelligence assessment from October 1944, evaluating the threat posed by what it called indigenous radicalization among American code talker units. The report argued that the code talkers, having been given access to high-level secrets and having proven their value to the war effort, might, after the war, demand recognition and rights that would be difficult to deny without appearing hypocritical. The report recommended that steps be taken to ensure that code talker contributions were not overly publicized, that individual operators be dispersed to different units to prevent them from forming a unified political voice, and that classification be maintained indefinitely to prevent the public from fully understanding what these men had accomplished. How James Cayeta obtained this document is unknown. Perhaps it was leaked to him by a sympathetic officer. Perhaps he found a way to access files he was not supposed to see. But the fact that he kept it hidden suggests that he understood its significance and perhaps feared what might happen if he tried to reveal it during his lifetime. The most disturbing element of the documents James Cayeta left behind was a list of names. 12 names, all of them Apache soldiers who had served as code talkers in the European theater. Next to each name was a date. 3 of those dates corresponded to the deaths in the munitions explosion of September 1944. 2 more corresponded to deaths that had been officially attributed to combat injuries, but that occurred during periods when the men's units were not engaged in active combat. Another 4 corresponded to deaths in the years immediately after the war, deaths that family members had always found suspicious but had been unable to prove were anything other than accidents or natural causes. That left 3 names, 3 men who, according to James Cayeta's list, should have died but somehow survived. One of those names was James Cayeta himself. The other 2 were men who had disappeared from public records entirely after 1945, as if they had been erased or had chosen to erase themselves. Researchers attempting to trace these men have hit walls at every turn. One of them, according to tribal records, died in 1953 in a car accident in New Mexico. But there is no death certificate on file with the state. The other man's trail ends in 1946. He simply vanished, leaving behind a wife and 2 children who told relatives that he had gone away on government business and never returned. Were these men hunted? Did they go into hiding? Did they fake their deaths to escape whatever fate had befallen their comrades? The answers remain elusive, obscured by time and by the determined efforts of powerful institutions to keep certain truths buried. In 2022, the British government announced that it would begin a comprehensive review of classified documents related to Native American military contributions in World War II. The announcement was met with cautious optimism by historians and by the descendants of code talkers. But, as of today, very few documents have actually been declassified. The review process has been delayed multiple times, and officials cite ongoing security concerns without explaining what security threats could possibly be posed by events that occurred 80 years ago. The truth is that the story of what the Queen said when Apache American soldiers first arrived in England, and what happened to those soldiers afterward, threatens more than just historical narratives. It threatens the mythology that victorious nations construct about themselves. It forces uncomfortable questions about whether the fight against fascism was truly a fight for justice and equality, or whether it was simply a fight for a different version of hierarchy and domination. What we know for certain is this: Apache soldiers came to England carrying knowledge that helped win the war. They were met by a queen who tried, imperfectly and within the constraints of her position, to honor them. Some of them were murdered by people who could not tolerate what they represented. The truth about these murders was suppressed for generations. And even now, even with all that has been revealed, there are those who would prefer that the story remain untold. The families of the Apache code talkers who died in suspicious circumstances deserve answers. They deserve to know who killed their ancestors and why. They deserve to know whether justice was ever pursued or whether powerful men protected other powerful men, while sacrifice and honor went unrecognized and unavenged. But more than that, all of us deserve to know the full truth about the wars we are taught to celebrate. We deserve to understand that every conflict, no matter how just its aims, is fought by human beings with human prejudices, human ambitions, and human capacity for both extraordinary courage and profound moral failure. The rain that fell on Windsor Castle in November 1943 has long since dried. The Grand Reception Hall has hosted thousands of meetings since then. The Queen who spoke Apache to an American officer is gone now, her secrets carried to the grave. Major James Kaita is gone. The 3 men who died in the explosion are gone. Sir Malcolm Pemberton, who finally broke his silence, is gone. But the questions remain. The classified files remain. And somewhere, in archives and attics and forgotten storage facilities, evidence remains that could finally complete this story. The question is whether those who hold the keys to those archives will find the courage to unlock them, or whether another generation will pass before the full truth emerges. In a world that often feels like it is spiraling into darkness, where lies proliferate faster than truth can catch up, where power still protects itself at the expense of justice, there is comfort to be found in something greater than human institutions and their failings. There is comfort in faith, in the knowledge that there is a higher accounting than the one recorded in classified files and official histories. The Apache soldiers who served and died believing in a cause greater than themselves. The Queen who tried to honor them within the limits of her position, and the countless others who fought for what was right even when institutions betrayed them. All of them trusted in something beyond the visible world, beyond the power structures that failed them. They trusted that there is ultimate justice, ultimate truth, and ultimate redemption. If you have followed this story to its end, if you have felt the weight of these revelations and the frustration of questions that may never be fully answered, remember this: the corruption of human systems does not invalidate the call to righteousness. The failures of institutions do not excuse us from pursuing truth. And the darkness of hidden histories makes it all the more important to walk in the light. Turn to God. Seek the path that Jesus Christ illuminated, the path of truth, justice, and love that transcends every human failure. In a world where powerful people bury inconvenient truths and where the sacrifices of the honorable are too often forgotten, there is one who sees everything, remembers everything, and will one day bring all hidden things to light. That is not just a promise. That is the foundation on which we must stand when human foundations crack and crumble beneath our feet. The story of the Apache code talkers in England is not finished. New evidence continues to emerge. New questions continue to be asked. And perhaps, in the fullness of time, the complete truth will be known. But whether it is or not, whether justice in this world is achieved or denied, we must hold fast to the belief that there is justice beyond this world, truth beyond our limited understanding, and grace sufficient for every failure and every wound. May you find that truth. May you walk in that light. And may the memory of those who sacrificed everything, only to be betrayed and forgotten, inspire you to live with courage, speak with honesty, and never allow power and prejudice to silence the voices of the righteous.